My name is Dr. Michael Brown, and this is 3 Words, a bite-sized podcast about the simple and yet strategic choices that all of us can make in order to become the very best version of ourselves. Today's conversation in the studio is strategic, but not necessarily simple. In fact, it's a hard conversation that I have with my son, Dr. Justin Brown, as we talk about the notion of writing people up, of, as you might have thought about in grade school, being a tattletale. Where the conversation went was very interesting. I was actually a little bit cautious about having this conversation with Justin in the studio because I wondered, is it relevant? Does it matter? Will people care? I think you will be fascinated as you listen in. Check it out. Well, Justin, Dr. Justin Brown, welcome to the studio today to engage in a very interesting conversation. Would you share our 3 words for today?
Yep. Today's 3 words are write 'em up.
Write 'em up. You know, as I hear that, it sounds a little bit like a conversation about being a tattletale. And so let me just ask you, why is this topic so important to you?
Yeah. So I think that as I think about write 'em up, I think that that is the pathway. It is one of the steps to making 3 realities happen. 1, I want to live in a world that is more just, where people who harm others are held accountable. I want to care for others in my life more deeply, where I'm able to stand up for and advocate for those who are harmed. And then in almost a little bit of a different vein, I want to work in a place that's more safe. And if there are problems that should be fixed, deficiencies that can be addressed, I want that to happen as well. And I think that writing them up can sometimes be the pathway to making those things happen.
This is such an interesting topic, Justin. We have never explored a topic such as this. I mean, we tend to talk about the 12 dimensions of life and how to grow and develop and become the best version of yourself. And this is a little bit an outlier to some of our typical conversations. But as I was even thinking about this conversation and even having some conversations with you off camera, this is really important. Obviously, it's important to you. You work in the medical profession. You probably see some injustices or maybe opportunities and in really situations where you feel like I need to step in and deal with this situation. But I'm also guessing for you personally, as you kind of travel the world, I know we're going to talk about some different examples that you have, you probably have seen a lot of opportunities to really step in and help do the very things that you talked about. But obviously there's listeners, there's viewers jumping in today. Why is this important to them?
Yeah. I think when I brought this topic up to you, at first you challenged it and said, I don't know if this will resonate with our listeners and our viewers, but I think that many of our listeners and many of our viewers, how many of us have seen an instance or experienced an instance of discrimination, of harassment of any kind, of mistreatment? How many have either experienced that for themselves or seen it and then not known what to do afterwards?
That's fair.
How many of us have been frustrated in our workplace when things just aren't working right because there are individuals that have attitudes or behaviors that are harmful to the culture, that are harmful to the workflow? How many of us have been frustrated with the status quo and saying, why isn't this thing changing? And how many people are wanting to make an investment to make a change? So I think that it really can be applicable to the workplace, to our personal lives, the moral dimension of life, the cultural dimension of life, as we talk about racial equity, as we talk about gender equality and so on. I think that it is an important topic that will probably actually resonate with a lot of our listeners and our viewers.
Well, even as you kind of spell out those bullet points of why people would care, I think you're right. I think there are those who are listening where they're already leaning in and thinking, this is very interesting, and they're already thinking of examples in their own life where they're like, wow, I need to think about how to step into this situation to bring maybe justice or improvement or so forth. But here's my challenge, and I'm going to push back on you a little bit, and that is I feel like that we are a culture that doesn't know how to initiate hard conversations. So I'm thinking to myself, well, why would I write anybody up? I'm going to step into a situation and I'm going to have a conversation, or I'm going to, obviously appropriately, with timing and tact and tone and transparency, all the things we talk about, how to have hard conversations. What I'm hearing you say, and I'm fearful that it will be misconstrued, is when something's happening, I don't have to deal with the situation. I just go into a back room, send an email, write a note, slip it under someone's door, anonymously even, and I don't have to actually engage in that situation in a way that I think as a culture, as a people, as communities, well, if I go down the road, as families, as friendship circles and so forth, we need to learn to just share those things and step into them and not just write them up.
I totally agree. And I think that this is the conversation today is when you see something, say something. But when you don't say something, write something. So I think that oftentimes we are not, I agree, we are not as good of bystanders as we should be. And there are circumstances where we can totally, with our privilege and with our presence, can engage in a situation and confront an individual, can say, hey, you're not following the workflow and it's hurting all of us in the workplace here, or you're creating a hostile work environment with the way that you said that thing, or the way that you communicated with that person, I found actually offensive to me, and I think that it was harmful. And I think that there is a time and a place for those things. And I think that there are kind of two main reasons that we don't do that well.
Okay.
I think the first reason is selfishness, that either in the moment that we are too focused on what we are doing, or we are not wanting to, make waves or put ourselves at risk in some way, but we are thinking about ourselves and we are not having our eyes opened to the injustices in the world around us.
Okay. I would agree with that.
And I think that what we can do, this idea of write them up, is, well, what do we do in those times where we have done nothing and after the fact you feel guilty and it is burning at your heart and gnawing at you and you're saying, why didn't I stand up to that person in the moment? That you can actually then use that guilt as to channel something productive, which I think is to write them up.
Okay.
Additionally, I think that the other reason that we are not good bystanders is another reason that I think is more reasonable and more justifiable is vulnerability. The sense of if, for you, Dad, as an individual, because of your privilege and because of your presence, you can step into a conversation and confront somebody and say something in a way that not everybody has access to do that in a way that is safe for them to do. I think that, if you think about a dramatic example of someone getting beat up on the street, for you to hop into that and try to confront that, you're putting yourself at physical danger. But even so, if in a similar vein, if there is sexual harassment in your workplace coming from your boss, for you to address that boss, there could be formal retaliation where that boss is like, oh, well, you're fired, or you're not getting a promotion, or I'm going to stop treating you as well. Or there's going to be that informal retaliation of I'm not going to talk to you as much. I'm not going to think about you when I'm looking for someone to do a big project. The people around you in the workplace are like, oh, Justin's the kind of person that is a tattletale, so we're not going to invite him to lunch anymore. And there's different forms of retaliation, that there's vulnerability there. And I think that that's another reason that we're not good bystanders.
I'm tracking with you in that. So I tend to think about that first one of selfishness and why don't you step into a situation and why aren't you willing to be uncomfortable, to do an uncomfortable thing for the sake of someone else or to make your workplace better or the world a more safe and just place. But I'm tracking with you in regards to that second reason because I think that's something that I didn't think about because it's true. I in most situations, if I see something and I'm concerned about something, I'm going to step in and have a conversation.
Yeah. So my encouragement to the viewers would be, when you see something, say something. I think that is the best approach. It can be most helpful. I know there have been times, even recently in my workplace, where I've said to a colleague, I think I'm going to write this person up for what they just said. And I've had appropriate pushback to me from colleagues and saying, hey, I think this is a person that would actually respond well to a conversation, and you should engage that conversation with them. And I appreciate that feedback and was responsive to that feedback in my workplace. And I think that there's a place for us dealing with our selfishness, being willing to step into hard conversations. But we also have to acknowledge that stepping into those conversations can put us at risk.
I'm going to pause right now in the middle of this episode and acknowledge that you probably already have heard some things that you're thinking to yourself, I need to share this with a friend or a coworker. Please do. Back to the episode. And I appreciate that. So it sounds like you are not saying jump right to writing them up.
Instead,
right? You can actually do one or both.
Yep.
So I'm even thinking of a situation. I supervise folks within a variety of spheres within my world, and I will engage in conversations, but then I'll also kind of take a note on that, and I'll record that. I'll document that. I'm not sending it to someone, but I think that what could even be ideal in your situation you described with that coworker is you have a conversation, but then maybe you do need to make a note, share that with someone else, document that, and not as a punishment or a tattletale. And I think that's always the challenge within culture, even as children. That's like the worst label you can have.
Yeah.
Right? You're a tattletale.
Yep.
And it almost seems like it's unloyal.
Yeah.
Versus actually turning the lens back on the offense.
Right.
Or the offender.
Of course.
Versus the reporter.
Yeah.
We tend to focus more on, I can't believe you did that. If you were loyal, if you were a friend, how could you tell? How could you tell on me?
Yes. That's a mean thing to do, to tell on somebody. But I think that there are times where in a sense, being a tattletale or writing them up could be a gift to the person that we're writing up.
No, I would agree with that.
And I think that there are times where we are not, as a humankind, we are not as responsive to feedback as we would like to believe. And sometimes it takes a supervisor, somebody else, a formal report being demonstrated. Hey, someone wrote this about you. Now that this has been written, I, as your supervisor, have to talk to you about this thing and have to create either some degree of accountability or consequences. That I think that we are more likely to change oftentimes when that's the case. And I know that there have been circumstances in my life where, even as I think about when I was a resident assistant, kind of the hall monitor in the undergraduate setting, that there were times where I let the power get to my head, where I was maybe treating residents harsher than I should have when I was addressing their drug use in the college dorm setting. Or there were times where, as I would, maybe there would be inequality in the way that, okay, I'm going to write this person up, but not this person up. And maybe the things that I would turn a blind eye to, there could have been inequity there, whether that's based on race or gender or socioeconomic status. I know that there were times where, had someone written me up, that in hindsight, I wonder if that would have prevented me from engaging in some of the more harmful, hostile, aggressive, letting the power get to my head kind of behaviors. I think too, we're talking about harassment and discrimination, some of those things, but even in my workplace right now, there was an instance a couple of months ago where I was working in a unit for about 2 months. And it wasn't till the end of the second month that someone came up to me and said, hey, just a heads up, the nurses are upset because you've been doing this thing wrong for 2 months now. And I was like, I wish that someone had, even if the person, because I recognize that within medicine, there's like this hierarchy and there's this degree of vulnerability that, I feel like if I report a nurse, I almost feel like, oh my gosh, that could put me at risk of retaliation from the nurses on the unit because they have some degree of power. But then also there's this hierarchy in medicine too, where it's like, oh, the doctors are above the nurses. So someone could have been afraid to engage that conversation with me. But I wonder, had someone the first time I did that process wrong, even if they felt vulnerable and didn't want to address it with me, if a report was made and someone said, hey, Dr. Brown should have been cleaning his instruments after this procedure and didn't do that, then I would have gotten that report back and the feedback, and I would have been like, oh, I didn't know that was the process. Nobody told me. Now I can fix that problem, and I can be grateful that that was the case. So I think that this idea of being a tattletale is a mean thing. I think, one, it can be a gift, and two, that sometimes those that are writing up the report are made to feel like, oh, you're creating an unsafe environment where we can't tell jokes anymore. But instead, am I not making it a safer environment by addressing and confronting a work environment that is hostile as it is? That for me, stepping into that, I'd like to think that I'm making it safer as opposed to creating an unsafe environment by being a tattletale in a sense.
That is very compelling. I think of everything we've talked about so far in the midst of this conversation, it's this turning the paradigm, shifting this perspective that by writing people up or tattletaling or having those hard conversations, it isn't creating a more toxic or unwelcoming environment. It is potentially creating a more dynamic, well, for sure diverse, but even safer, more positive, more productive environment.
So I think that the last point I want to talk about as far as barriers to writing them up is this idea that when you say to someone, oh, you should write that up, you should document that, that you will often get the feedback of, that's not going to make a difference. It's not worth it. It's not worth your investment or your energy because the system will never change. But I think that the system won't be fixed until we use the system to fix the system. There are processes and protocols and workflows in place where if something is inappropriate that's happening or something that's unsafe that's happening or something that is out of the appropriate protocol, that we're supposed to document those things. And I think if we never use the system isn't going to be fixed. And I think for you, even as I think about, you're a manager, you have employees that you oversee, there are probably things that are happening but beneath your nose that you're not aware of, that you're responsible for hiring and firing, but there are probably people that work for you that everyone else is like, why haven't they been fired yet? But nobody's written them up. That there's no possibility for the system to be fixed. There's no possibility for accountability because we're not willing to use the system to fix the system.
Wow, this is great. Practical steps.
Yeah.
What do we do? Here we are. We're listening to this conversation. I'm guessing for our listeners and viewers are thinking, well, I need to think about who I can write up or what maybe even conversations that have happened in the weeks or even days recently that need to be addressed.
Yeah. So I'd love to share kind of briefly an anecdote of something that I'd experienced and use it kind of as a way of sharing maybe some steps to write them up.
Okay.
So Noelle and I were flying back from Mexico from our family vacation, and our flight was delayed. So we knew we were going to miss our connecting flight. So we go to kind of the American Airlines, recheck your bags, ticket counter. We're getting our hotel room for the night because we're not going to make it till the next morning. And there was other passengers on our flight from out of Mexico that had a connecting flight that they could have made. And if maybe you recall when you are coming from out of the country and getting another flight, you don't have to recheck your bags. You can just you grab your checked bags, you drop them, and you go straight to your flight and you book it. And there was a woman, a young Spanish-speaking woman who was flying with us out of Mexico, who was with her 2, maybe 3 and 6-year-old child. And she didn't realize that you could just drop your bag real quick, and you could tell she was in the rush. So she hopped to the front of the line. It was just trying to get some quick assistance. And there was an older white woman employee who came out from behind the counter and didn't, kind of respectfully ask her, hey, is there a reason you hopped to the front of the line? How can I help you today? It was immediately finger in the face. I'm going to call security and this is going to turn into something. And it was this very, everyone was super uncomfortable in the line with us. And eventually what happened is she was helped by another employee, and the employee was like, oh, you can just drop your bag and go. So she's running with her bag and her 3 and 6-year-old child behind her. And the woman who I mentioned the first time yells after them, see, you were jumping up in front of line for no reason at all. So it felt to me that not only was it rude, I could not help but see that there was a component there where I felt like that was racially charged. So I hear the steps now. You're in the moment when you're feeling these emotions of shock, of frustration, maybe annoyance, of guilt, and you feel those feelings and you'll identify what are those feelings that I'm having. Secondly, and this is what I then did, is I thought to myself, what is my intention? If I were to write someone up, what is my intention? Is my intention to create accountability? Is it
to get them in trouble?
Right. What is the intention? Or is it to prevent harm in the future? What is the intention? The third step would then be to say, with both of these things in mind, I'm going to decide to write them up. Then I quickly kind of wrote down on my phone some of the details that I could remember, where it was, when it was. I showed them to Noelle, who was with me, and I said, how do these details, is this right? Do you remember how she said this exactly? And then did she say this? Or then, so you collect kind of the information, you write it down quick so you don't forget it. And then you identify the process. What is the where can I report this? Where can I submit this report? What is the process in place? I'm not going to just email the president of American Airlines and try to assume that that's going to make a difference. I need to follow whatever the right workflow is. So I found that the U.S. Department of Transportation has a civil rights division where you can submit reports about discrimination. So I had identified that. Then I wrote out the facts of the account in the most objective, evidenced way that I could possibly say, on this date, at this location, with this person, at this time, and these were the other people who were present, and trying to give as many details and evidence as I could. Then I kind of showed it to Noelle and I said, does this look right to you? And she said, oh, fix this. Actually, it's this. And I, try to get as accurate as I could. I think also you can invite other people that were present. Hey, why don't you also write a report? And there could be several reports of the same account that I think build a helpful paper trail of more and more evidence about whatever happened. Then I signed my name on it. So there was the opportunity for it to be anonymous, but I wanted my name to be on it so that I could use, in a sense, that privilege that I had, that I'm not in a vulnerable position there. I wanted the airline to potentially be able to reach out to me if they had any further questions or things I could clarify. And then basically you submit the report and you trust the process.
Yeah.
It can be hard to believe that this could make any difference, and maybe it won't, and it perhaps won't, but I think it is worth my investment in trying to make that workplace less hostile and the world more just.
And I'm guessing you're hoping that the process would lead to an honest, open conversation with a supervisor, with this particular American Airlines employee, and she would be open, and she would be teachable, and she would be humble, and actually there would be change of behavior and perspective moving forward.
Yeah.
I am curious, because this is how I'm wired, was there a space or a place or an opportunity for you to just say, ma'am, if I may, can I have a conversation with you? Several of us around here are pretty uncomfortable with what we just saw and what we just witnessed. And I think that you had this woman who was in a vulnerable position with her young children, and it seemed like you really came at her hard. I'm curious if you've thought about, should you have engaged with, or was there even an opportunity for that?
And there was we were like next in line behind this woman. There was a long line of people behind us, and everyone's stressed because they just had their flight, that they missed their flight. Right. So I felt like that wasn't the space and the place to make that happen. Had she been the employee that called us up next into the line, then I think that I might have engaged that conversation. I actually asked the person that I went up to, I said, would you let me know that person's name? Because I'd like to be able to report them. That is my way of trying to be actively present. And even when the woman was next in line, eventually she just stayed up at the front of the line after the woman yelled at her and said she was going to call security on her. And then when they were calling me up to line, I said, you can go ahead to the woman. So that was my way of, I think, being engaged in what was happening in that moment. But I also think that if it just ended there, then there can't be a paper trail. There cannot be, maybe this happens every single day. And maybe it's always with the Spanish-speaking passengers with their 2 young children.
I also appreciated how in your list of practices and things to do, how you talked about explore your intentions, to check your heart, and to think, why am I doing this? Because I'm sure in some workplaces where someone does this little thing, but you don't like that person.
Right.
It's like, ooh, here's my opportunity.
This is it.
I'm going to get them in trouble, and I'm going to get them out of my way, and I can get my promotion, not them. And so I like that idea of, this is not a retaliatory kind of practice. This is a caring practice. This is a just practice. This is an opportunity, like you said, to make the world a just place, to make work environments safer. And so, as is often the case, Justin, you were wiser than me, and you pushed forward and said, no, Dad, we really should do this episode. Because I do think, as I've listened to you and sat with you here today, it was an important conversation and worthy of great reflection. And I will do it personally, and I would encourage our listeners and our viewers to do the same. Thanks for the conversation today.
Thanks, Ed.
For life coaching, consulting services, or to hire a keynote speaker, please visit dmbcoaching.com.